All right, so I'm going to make broccoli according to the broccoli recipe that is in our lab manual. I'm just going to show you how to cut the florets off of the tough woodier stems. Basically, I'm just going to take my chef's knife and kind of cut down in like that. And then you can see a lot of the florets kind of break off on their own. This can be set aside. You could use that in stock or something like that. You can also just put it in a compost. But then you can see these floret pieces almost kind of break apart. And if they don't, then you can pull them apart with your fingers until you get to the place where it's hard to pull them apart, and then you could cut a little bit more of that hard stem off and then just continue to pull them apart. Okay, now that I've got all the florets broken apart, I'm just gonna put them into a colander and then rinse them really well with water so they're nice and clean. I haven't cleaned them yet. Okay, so we've got 1 quart of water here. That's also 4 cups of water, and I'm gonna add a ½ teaspoon of salt to that, and then stir to allow that salt to dissolve. Okay, so we need 3/4 of a pound of fresh broccoli, and so a pound is 16 ounces, and 3/4 of 16 ounces is 12 ounces. So you can see here I've weighed out 12 ounces of broccoli, and I'm gonna put that into the 1 quart of water that has a ½ teaspoon of salt mixed into it. And we're just going to allow that to soak. And what's happening here is we're hoping some osmosis takes place, that an area of more salt concentration will soak into the broccoli, which has less salt concentration. Okay. Very important that while your broccoli is soaking in the salt water for 10 minutes, that you start water boiling in a saucepan so that once you have drained and rinsed your broccoli, you can put it into the boiling water and it's ready to go. Okay, so the broccoli has sat in the salt water for 10 minutes, and I'm going to just run some clean water over the broccoli, drain it and rinse it really well. Okay, so I put my drained, rinsed broccoli into boiling water, and you can tell that it really cools it down because this was rapidly boiling just a second before I put this broccoli in here. But we're gonna allow it to come back to a boil. We're gonna leave the lid off because we don't wanna contain the acid. If you contain acid in a vegetable that has chlorophyll as a pigment, it will turn an olive green color, and we don't want that. So we wanna allow the acid to escape. So we're going to cook this until it's tender crisp. I'm going to be testing that with a paring knife by pushing it into the stem end of the floret just to see if it enters and exits the stem end of the floret easily. Okay, so as you can see, we have gotten back up to a boil. I'm just going to stir the broccoli around a little bit just to make sure that all of the parts and pieces are making contact and not floating up. While I'm in here, I'm just going to try and give a little push into the stems, and I am not able to get in there at all. So we've got a little more cooking left to go. Okay, so now that we've got our broccoli boiling, I'm going to start on the bechamel sauce that we're going to put over the top of this broccoli. We're gonna melt 2 tablespoons of butter into a pan. And then to that butter, once it's melted, we're going to add 2 tablespoons of flour. And then it's kind of hard to see, but over here on the side, I do have some salt. I have 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt. So now we've got a really nice bright green color, and I'm gonna try and stick my knife into the stem end of the broccoli. I think we're getting close to the tender crisp stage. I'm gonna let it go for maybe 45 more seconds here. Over here, we've just melted all of our butter into our pan, and we're gonna add the flour and salt to that. Now, as we stir this cooked paste of flour and fat, we have just created a roux in our pan. A roux is the base of a bechamel sauce. Once we add some milk to this, then we can officially call it a bechamel sauce. Now that we've allowed the roux to cook for a minute or two to get the raw starch flavor out, we're gonna add in 1 cup of milk and then stir that around. We're going to allow that to come to a bubble so that we have a thickened bechamel sauce.
And this is kind of like when we made the bechamel sauce for our cheeseburger soup.
Yep, this is the very same process as we did for cheeseburger soup with the cheese. Okay, so we just drained the broccoli while we still have a bright green color to the broccoli. And I'm just going to kind of let this sit for a second as we finish up the cheese. So now that our bechamel has started to just thicken slightly, we're going to start putting in 3/4 of a cup of cubed processed American cheese. You could also use shredded cheddar cheese if you like that better. It's really a preference for you. One important thing to think about with processed American cheese is that it has an emulsifier in it. And so processed American cheese is made to melt really smoothly. If you use something like shredded cheddar cheese, not that it would be bad, it would just release its oil, and so you might have an oil layer at the top of your sauce. And then another thing about cheeses that are not that don't have an emulsifier, they get kind of stringy when you melt them. And so those are just two characteristics that you would have to look out for if you were using something like shredded cheddar cheese. Okay, so now that we've gotten all of the pieces of the processed American cheese in here, we're gonna have this on a pretty low heat because we don't wanna scorch or curdle the dairy products that are in here. The smaller the pieces you're able to get, the easier it is for this to melt, the faster it will melt, which is a good thing. But I will tell you, processed American cheese is very sticky, so it's very difficult to work with. If you try to cut it with a knife, it just kind of mushes back together and sticks to your knife. Again, some recipes tell you to grate it. Don't even try it. It makes a giant mess. As you saw me do earlier, I just broke it into pieces with my fingers, and that's usually the best way to go.
If you watched our cheeseburger soup, I cut it and it was so hard to do. And it just stuck to my knife so bad.
Okay, so we've got our cheese sauce. The cheese is all melted. We've got some broccoli laid out on a plate here, and we're just going to drizzle some of this cheese sauce over the top of the broccoli. Corinne and I just tried the broccoli, and we really hit the tender crisp. It's not mushy. I can still bite through and feel the texture of the broccoli, but it's still soft enough that it is easy to eat. And it has a really great flavor. The cheese adds a lot of flavor to the broccoli as well. And just as a little side note here, if you can notice that after the cheese sauce has sat for a little bit, it's got a skin forming on the top of it. Any starch thickened mixture, as it cools, the surface dries out and gets this skin, and that's called retrogradation.